Tyra is changing you in ways you never knew. Join the class, find out how. And what we were discussing was the enormous significance of charity, specifically in terms of bringing Mashiach, in terms of bringing the redemption, and understanding the Alter Rebbe's perspective on how we are going to bring redemption, how we are going to bring Mashiach, understanding that vision of transforming the world, shifting all of the items that receive their energy from that mid-road, not overt godliness and not an energy of shards and husks that I can't penetrate, but that road covered over. There's the klipa, there's the husk, there's the shards around it, but through there the light penetrates. I can access that energy. I have to shift all that to godliness, and then basically that's redemption, because when that shifted to godliness, that absolute evil that is impenetrable, of course it has godliness in it, otherwise it wouldn't exist, but I can't access that godliness. It just disappears. It has nothing to feed off because it's feeding off that intermediate one, which is feeding off the overt godliness. So all that's left is godliness. It's a world of redemption. So understanding that, it makes sense how charity is so incredibly significant in terms of bringing redemption, because we said from a efficiency perspective, there's nothing that moves it as quickly, quantitatively. The greatest quantities of that intermediate level called klipas noiga are going to get shifted because, as we said, when I work, I'm putting my whole self in my job. And when I put my whole self in my job, and then I take that money, and that money is a percentage of the money I earn, so therefore it's really impacting the whole money, and that whole money came from that whole work, so it's really tying back to my whole work. All of that, the money given to charity, the entirety of the money from which this percentage is coming, the entirety of the work that created the entirety of the money from which this percentage is coming, all of that is shifting from that level, again, that's Kabbalistically called klipas noiga, a channel through which godliness is coming into this world with a lot of cloaks to mask it, to disguise it, but I can still access it. I'm shifting a lot of that to God, because I put my whole self in earning that money. So my whole self, my whole animal self, my whole physical body self is all being given over, as is the work, as is the totality of the money, to create that percentage given to charity. So that was very, very, very effective and efficient. And if you look inside, if anyone's looking inside, we got like 2 more pages of this chapter. We're not done. Well, what's left? What's left is, but there's another commandment as well that's very, very significant in bringing redemption. Totally different commandment from a totally different perspective. And that is the commandment of Torah study. And Torah studies, spiritual advantages have like nothing to do with all the spiritual advantages of charity. The Torah study is also incredibly significant in bringing redemption. And it also, in very unique ways, shifts the fabric of this world and gives it to God like nothing else. We said charity affects like nothing else because charity takes such quantities of self, of animal self, of physical self, of all that work, of all that money, and shifts it all to God. Well, Torah study does it differently. I wouldn't call it quantitatively as incredibly effective, but in a qualitative way, it does things and shifts things like no other way of serving God can. So before we learn what the Alter Rebbe is going to explain to us, the enormous significance of Torah study in general, and specifically in our mission here of we need redemption now, do you feel something different when you study Torah? Do you feel when you study Torah that it affects you more deeply than when you do the other commandments? Does anyone see that in themselves?
I'm a slow starter. So I was asked to volunteer recently at the CMC to learn with somebody who doesn't know much yet. And
you told us about that. I was so excited for you. Yes, you said that in your thank you God.
And I'm really like loving it. And I hope she's gaining from it, and certain things that I delved into years ago that I'm teaching her. It's just different, like relearning it where I am now, and with her, I think she's maybe slowly being convinced that it's a good thing to do in your old age. She's not that old.
Like being a teacher. I think what you're saying is that when you teach it, you acquire it in an even deeper way than when you study it. And that's very true.
But and the other thing is, when I do learn, I don't want to say I don't learn. You can't even like weigh certain things, like when you write a check for tzedakah or you give your credit card today, if it's a wonderful feeling. Everything like Yiddishkeit is so set up with so many wonderful aspects to it that we're the most fortunate people, any place, even with everything going on and in the crazy world and everything, we really have it all, except we need Mashiach. But I'm saying each different thing does something else for us in a different realm.
You're so right. We need Mashiach, and we're very blessed. And we live with God, and we know we live with God, and we feel that we live with God, and that's the biggest thing we could have. Anyone else has a sense of something special happens when they study, when they learn Torah?
Hi, it's Estarina. And yeah, I think there's a special energy and, a special light. I mean, I just came from, a shear that I actually had to prepare, and, coming away from it, it was exciting leading up to it, and just there's, energy and light and connection to Hashem, like connection to Hashem's Torah is very joyful, filling, satisfying.
It is. It's sometimes hard to put in words. Someone just chatted to me, peace. That when she studies, she feels inner peace, like nowhere else. And I think that's very true. Something like you're saying, a light and energy. And as Sarah said, it's so true. Every different aspect of service gives us something different. And we're not saying, well, we like Torah study so much, we're not going to pray, and we're not going to say Psalms, Tehillim, and we're not going to, no, of course. And we get something from Shabbos like nothing else, and something from keeping kosher like nothing else. Every aspect feeds a very specific part of us, but Torah is viewed as definitely different. And like Estarina is saying, maybe it feeds us in a certain energy that nothing else does. Anyone else has that experience when they study, that they feel like something that they don't feel the other times when they're serving God, though that feels good too?
Hi, it's Dottie. Hi. When I study, I feel like I'm being protected. I feel like God's protecting me. And
that makes so much sense, because you're within Him in a way like nothing else. So you're within His energy, you're within His embrace, and you feel it. And that's, I think, where you feel protected, safe. Yeah. I think that's why someone said peace. I think that's the same idea. You're just, even if you're not consciously aware of it, but that's what's happening. So you, on a soul level, feel that peace and feel that safety and feel that protection, because you're very much within God when you study. Very, very much. Very much. Anyone else? I would also say, just for myself, I also always feel very like I'm connecting to the source of my blessings. I don't know another way to put it, but like I'm plugged into the source, which I guess is sort of like what Dottie's saying, sort of like that chat, just my own way of interpreting that feeling of like, okay, I'm plugged into the source of blessings. Like, just, this is it. This is the most powerful energy I can draw down is happening now as I study. And that's also like a very strong feeling of just like strength. Of just it all coming down, because I'm so intently connecting to God. I'm studying. So with all that, all of which is true, let's look at how the Rebbe explains it. Now, this is not the only source in Tanya where the Rebbe focuses on the enormity of Torah study. The first time we discussed this was in chapter 5, where the Rebbe brought a few special, unique advantages of Torah study. The Rebbe there focused on the duality of the embrace, that uniquely with Torah study, you're embracing God, and simultaneously God is embracing you on a mental level, on a soul level. There's such a synergy because your mind is within His and His thoughts are within your mind. And at the same time, because again of the fusion and embrace, Torah study very uniquely feeds your soul. We actually learned in chapter 5 that the only thing that feeds your soul is Torah study. We can and do commandments perhaps all day long, because there's certain commandments that are happening all the time. So we're always doing commandments. We're always serving through the commandments, through the mitzvahs, but they don't feed my soul. They protect my soul, but feeding only is with Torah study, which would mean that without it, your soul could feel sort of weak and de-energized and depleted, even though you're serving God all day long and you're eating kosher food and you're dressing modestly and you're keeping the Sabbath, the Shabbos, and you're still weak because you don't have energy, because your soul isn't being fed because you're not studying Torah. So that was an incredible, very practical, significant advantage of Torah study we discussed in chapter 5. In chapter 23, for reasons in that train of thought that we were discussing then in chapter 23, we again focused on Torah study as unique and different than all the commandments. And there we focused on the fusion. We spoke of how closely you become one with God and explained that only through Torah study, you, your soul, and the inner garments of thought and speech literally are so fused, it's like one. There's no separation. And in the commandments, you become very, very close when you're serving God and doing the commandments. Your body is his chariot. Your soul and God are like body to soul, tremendous synergy. But one, really one, that's Torah. And now we're coming back to the idea again from the flow of thought, chapter 37, which is Torah study as uniquely helping us bring the redemption in its own way like nothing else. And again, charity, we said, does what everything else does, but better, because every commandment shifts a piece of your animal soul, an aspect of your body, an aspect of the items of this world to God from that realm of, as we call Kabbalistically, klipas noiga, where there's barriers over God energy, but I can access God through the barriers. An aspect of animal soul, an aspect of body, an aspect of world gets shifted to God. And with charity, my whole animal soul and a lot of this world gets shifted to God. So charity is doing the same thing everything else is doing, but much more so. That's why I've said it's a very efficient method to move a lot and bring redemption now. Torah study qualitatively changes the reality in a way that nothing else does. And the Rebbe here enumerates a number of ways that Torah study is different than everything else. So let's start learning that inside. We're on page Memtes, and we're 2.5 lines from the top of the page. Umasha Kasuf, Masha Amr Razal. Umasha Amr Razal, Shatam Torah Kneged Kulam. I just told you how enormously special charity is. That which it says, and the study of Torah is equal to everything? Huh? I'm saying charity is beyond and above. And so why do I just say Torah study is equal to everything, which means in a sense, everything, whatever everything accomplishes, Torah study uniquely can do more, different, beyond what everything else does. Hainu, meaning to say, because Torah study affects uniquely our speech and our thoughts, our inner powers. It's very interesting because, of course, since chapter 35, 36, and deeply into 37, we've been focusing on action and the specialness of action. And we believe in everything we said until now, but that doesn't discount the enormous inner dimension of speech and even more so of thought. Because these are the inner garments of that vital, meaning animal soul. Again, I'm focusing on the animal soul because I still have the same vision. I want to take my animal soul. I want to take the klipas night of this world. I want to take the physicality of this world. I want to give it to God. So I'm still focusing this whole chapter. I wasn't focusing on my godly soul until now. But even within my animal soul, to reach the thought and speech of animal soul, that's uniquely, profoundly happening in Torah study. And even more deeply than this is even more unbelievable. And until now, we didn't think this was possible. We are shifting something we thought impossible for the first 36.5 chapters of Tanya. The intellect of the klipas noiga itself, in that vital animal soul, nichlolos b'kedusha mamish, is actually right now comprised in the realm of complete God energy. When one is studying Torah deeply, with analysis, with intellect, with mind, when you just sort of say the words, none of this counts. So the Rebbe here actually told us two very special, very unique things that basically only happen when you study Torah. Now, again, I said lots of great things in chapter 5. Wow, the only food of your soul. Very special, but not relevant to our discussion at hand about bringing redemption. Spoke in chapter 23, that degree of fusion. But now I'm talking about bringing redemption. And bringing redemption, I have to shift that intermediate level where the godliness is accessible but cloaked, klipas noiga, which means, and we said, my main mission is shifting self, body, and animal soul. My animal soul is what I have to give to God. So the Rebbe says, within your animal soul is expressed, just like your godly soul, in 3 ways. Only in the thoughts, in the speech, and in the actions. So in action, every commandment I do, basically, is going to, on some level, affect the action of, that power of action of the animal soul. But uniquely, Torah gives the speech and thought of the animal to God. Now, what do you mean the speech and thought of the animal? I'm studying Torah. It's not the animal speech and thought. It's Torah's speech and thought. It's my godly soul speech and thought. True. But as we learned in 35 and have been reiterating several times in 37, anytime my godly soul is working, is impacting my body, she is going through, she is kidnapping, she is using as her conduit the animal soul. So the godly soul, through the animal soul, affects the body. If I'm studying now Torah, we are studying now Torah. My power of thought, godly, let's go back all the way. My godly soul is expressing herself through the godly power of thought, which is now harnessing the animal soul's power of thought, which is now then able to reach the human body, my brain cells' power of thought, which is even affecting my very brain cells. Godly soul's power of thought, animal soul's power of thought, human power of thought, physical brain. All of these are now within Torah study. So every commandment, almost, is giving the animal soul's power of action. That was what was harnessed by the godly soul's power of action to affect the body's power of action. But in Torah, uniquely, it's the thought and speech. Now, of course, you can say, well, you could always bring in thought when you're serving God, and you should, and that's true. And there are other commandments of speech, of course. We pray, we say psalms, we bless God. But the depth of God investment in speech and in thought, nothing like in Torah study. Because in thought, what's in your godly power of thought, and in your animal power of thought, and in your human power of thought are God's very thoughts. So that uniquely is shifting the animal soul's ability like nothing else. That was the first very special way Torah is going to bring redemption, because it's going to give to God aspects of the animal soul that are not normally given. But then the Rebbe said something way more incredible, which was the second very special advantage of Torah study. Until now, when we've been discussing giving to God my animal, we mean the animal soul's powers of expression. As I just said, my godly soul power of thought, my animal soul power of thought, my human power of thought. And we've done this a number of times throughout this chapter. What we never discuss is the animal soul herself, the essence energy of the animal soul, because that's animal. And that animal, like we learned in chapter 35, basically checks out. And if you remember, goes to sleep, can't handle it. Like a very young baby, a newborn baby, when there's a lot of noise around, the baby's sleeping, checks out, can't handle that overload. So the animal soul, when the animal soul is engaged in something godly, like serving God, the essence core of that animal soul does not want to be doing what it's doing, hijacked, kidnapped. So it checks out, it, so to speak, goes to sleep, shuts down, and the powers of the animal soul are being utilized as the bridge between the godly and the body, and therefore are serving God, and therefore are being given to God, and this is great, and this is amazing, this is a reason why I'm in this world. But when I study Torah, that study, the Torah itself, is so powerful, it actually reaches the animal soul herself. Your animal is changing. You are changing. Your animal nature is changing. A part of your animal nature is changing, which is unbelievable, because who doesn't want to escape the animal nature? And we sort of thought until now that it's impossible. You know, we are humans. We have a very godly, our core is God. We are all at our core, literally a piece of God. And we have these appendages of animal, of evil that we struggle with, that we deal with, that we will be free from when the redemption comes. And that's it. No, The Rebbe says here, you didn't think you could do it. You thought only the holiest of holy, who we call the tzaddik, that completely godly individual, transcending the limits of humanity, only the tzaddik can do this. No, the Rebbe says, when you study Torah, you change the nature, not just of the expressions of your animal, which is what we've been saying since chapter 35, which was an enormous innovative thought of chapter 35. Now we're going way beyond. You change the nature of the animal herself. Very specifically, you change the intellect of the animal, meaning the animal soul is a parallel mirror image, so to speak, of the godly soul, and as such has the 3 intellectual faculties and the 7 emotive faculties. We do not affect and shift the emotions of the animal. That's like too intense. That's really the core of our animal soul's negative energy, is that emotion. That we're not changing. But the animal soul also has an intellectual component. The 3 powers of intellect, not as developed perhaps as in our godly soul, but they're the intellect of the animal. And that changes when we study God's will and wisdom. When we study Torah, the intellect of the animal is invested in the Torah, because studying Torah is very different than doing a commandment. Meaning, if you are eating kosher, your body's eating kosher, your power of animal soul is getting your body to do the actions needed to eat kosher, but it doesn't have to be buying into it at all. It's just doing something. A person could eat kosher and not buy into kosher, but eat it. A person could be dressed modest, but not have bought into it, but be dressed that way. You could do the laws while inside you're detached from what's going on. But to truly be studying Torah, you have to truly be studying. You have to truly be invested. You have to truly comprehend it. So the Rebbe is saying, when you really do it, when you really get it, when you really understand it, your animal soul understands it as well. There's no other way to do it. So it's not like she could be, well, this is just happening through me, but I'm not really. What do you mean? You're understanding it or not? You're getting it or not? You're intellectually comprehending it or not? Well, if you're intellectually comprehending it, you're internalizing its impact. So therefore, and again, our perspective in chapters 36 and 37 to bring redemption is transform all that animal energy, transform all that, as we call it Kabbalistically, klipas noiga energy. And we were saying that every commandment transforms an aspect of animal soul. Charity transforms, the entirety. But we're all talking about expressions. Through Torah study, and only through Torah study, the animal soul herself, the intellect of the animal, is given to God. And there's no other way we can affect, not the expressions, but the animal herself. You are changing. So we're going to go back to what someone said to me about having peace when I study, or as Dottie said, protection, safety. We're shifting. Our animal is shifting. We are, of course, every time we serve God, we become more godly, but we are here transforming ourselves in such a deep way, because the essence of our animal is literally changing because it's absorbing the thoughts of Torah. And what is Torah? God, God's will, God's wisdom. So that is a unique tool in giving animal to God and bringing redemption. And for ourselves, also a unique tool to understand how we shift, how we become different people as we immerse ourselves in Torah study, because my animal is changing. My animal is becoming refined. So I'm a different person. I'm a far more godly person, because even on the level of my animal is becoming godly as I study God's will and wisdom, as I study Torah. So let's read inside where the Rebbe clarifies this idea of the difference of the effect on the intellect of the animal versus on the emotions of the animal. Now, even though the essence of the animal soul, which is the emotions, as we said, the animal soul is an animal, it's ruled by emotions. So that essence, a regular person, the Benoni, who's completely serving God, never does anything wrong, never says anything wrong, never thinks anything wrong consciously. But still, even such a person cannot shift the emotions. That's the intensity of the negative energy of the animal. Because the emotions are so strongly linked to evil, much, much more so than the intellect of the animal. As is known, because there, in a Kabbalistic way, it's getting nurtured, it's getting fed from the holiness of the godly emotions more deeply than the intellect is. Because again, that's the nature of the animal soul. So what the Rebbe was saying here is just to clarify that when we're saying we're shifting the animal herself, we're shifting the intellect of the animal. Well, why aren't we shifting the emotions? Or for that matter, why don't we shift the emotions when we do commandments, with commandments very much linked to emotions? They do link to emotions, but the emotions of the animal soul are so strongly sourced in evil because they have such power, because they're absorbing such power from godliness, and they're the inverse of it. So it goes in their side to evil. That evil is so strong, we can't get near it. We can't touch it. We can't shift it. For that, we need redemption, or we need to be the tzaddik. But for the rest of us, the intellect only is our realm of possibility. And it's an amazing concept, because until now, we didn't think anything we could shift. And now we learned we can shift the intellect of the animal through this one unique tool, true study of Torah. And again, I say true study of Torah, as the Rebbe emphasizes, you have to really understand, you have to really be focused, you have to really get it, because the whole reason the animal is shifting is because the intellect of Torah is gripping the intellect of the animal soul, and therefore there's a tremendous impact. So if you're sort of like learning, not exactly understanding, but you want to give a check on your chart, it's not going to shift the intellect of the animal. But if you're really studying and really getting it, every single time you study, it changes. Anyone can look at themselves, and again, I don't know if we could exactly see this point, but we could see the impact of it. And the impact of it would be a refinement. The impact of it would be that your thoughts are different. That maybe before you started studying Torah, your thoughts were gripping you more in far more negative ways, and now they don't. They don't bother you as much, or they don't go in as negative directions. If negative could mean in the negative pessimistic directions, negative fearful directions, or in negative forbidden directions, your thoughts are just naturally more God-centered, more easily, freely feeling God's presence, and more refined. Of course, for some people, they've been studying Torah their whole lifetime, or for many, many, many years. For some people, it's less. Maybe it's easier to see the change. But can anyone look at themselves and actually see that change as they've been studying Torah over these years?
Hi. So I mean, of course, I mean, I can see the different person that I am because of learning Torah and learning Tanya and davening and doing all this wonderful work. And but I also can see that when my husband and me, we'll sit around the table and we'll talk about world events, world things that's happening, and then he'll just take the book and start reading from the Tanya, and then just everything changes. Everything just becomes, and your mind. I mean, really, I mean, the atmosphere in the whole room changes when we do that.
That's
so
beautiful.
Now we know how to shift from the worries and fears of what's happening, right? The current events. When we want to shift, we just pick up the Sefer and we'll start talking about it, discussing it, and it just changes everything. So, yeah, absolutely, 100%.
That is so beautiful. That's a great tip for all of us. When the world is too real and too fearsome, study, and then you feel God's presence. Very true, very beautiful. Anyone else has seen in themselves a shift in their mind as they study? I can definitely say I have, especially through studying Hasidus. even though I was raised in a Chabad home, I didn't really formally study Hasidus until I was post high school in seminary. So that's like 18. And I could, because again, I wasn't like 5, I was 18. So I could see it so clearly. It was so intense and obvious to me, so strong, that enormous shift in my thoughts, in my processing of the world, in my awareness of God. Again, being raised totally religious and having no problems and issues with God's reality, but it just shifted completely as I started studying Hasidus. God was so real, and God's presence in the world was so real. And like Rachel is saying, when you look at the world through that paradigm, through that filter of God's reality, the world looks so different because it's so affected by the God in the world. So I saw it so dramatically then, in such an incredible way. And I would definitely say over the years, perhaps more subtly, drop by drop, but I could definitely see the change in my thoughts. The more Torah, and most specifically Hasidus, penetrates my godly thoughts, my human thoughts, my animal thought. Very strong. Anyone else? Anyone else has been fortunate enough to actually see it?
I find it easier to dan l'chafrus. Hello?
Yes, that makes sense, Esther, because your animal thinking is changing. So that's a very clear expression of your animal thoughts, looking at someone else and processing what they're doing in a positive light, in a favorable light. That's an intellectual faculty. That's something you're doing with your mind. And since your animal mind is more in sync with God, your animal mind can also judge favorably and see the good in people and see the good or the possible good in action. So that makes perfect sense. That's exactly this idea. Anyone else?
Right.
Anyone else has seen it?
Yeah. I mean, I think that Chassidus has brought, to my awareness, different dimensions of what we call reality. There's a depth in everything that goes all the way to the core godliness in every single object around us, and then every level of concealment in between, and just made me start seeing the world differently.
Right. Our animal soul is getting open to God is world. World is God, God is world. That's one. And because our thoughts of animal are changing. So it's really a beautiful process. And again, maybe for some people it's more subtle and it's harder for them to exactly see that. But sometimes you take a step back and think how you used to think and you used to process prior to studying. And then you can look at how you think naturally now and you're like, wow, something really shifted. Because your animal really shifted. So we have here focused on 2 ways Torah study is unique in giving God the faculty of thought and speech of my animal, and in giving God actually my animal itself, the thoughts of my animal, not her expressions, but her. And I want to give that animal to God, and that's a very profound tool of bringing redemption. Well, Torah study is doing something nothing else does. Now we're going to say a 3rd way Torah study is unique. This, and additionally, and this is actually greater. This is actually greater beyond anything we've said until now. What we've said until now has been pretty stupendous. But this is beyond that. The Milas Esek Talmud Torah al Kol HaMitzvahs. In the way the study of Torah is beyond any other service of God. Based on what we said above, now we quoted this above in chapter 23 of Tanya, where, as I said, we also focused on Torah's special quality. So there we quoted from the Zohar, from a section of Zohar called Tikkunei Zohar. What does it say there in the Zohar? The 248 commandments, meaning biblically there are 613 commandments, of which 248 are positive things we have to do, while 365 are prohibitions. So those 248 biblical positive injunctions are the 248 limbs of the king. Ukamo ba'adam hatachton derech mashal, and just like in a human, so to speak, ein arof v'dimyon klal, we cannot at all compare ben achayit sheberamach evarav, the vitality, the degree, the intensity of vitality in the limbs of his body, in contrast to the energy of his thoughts, of his brain. Shuha seichel, meaning the intellect, which subdivides into these three elements of Chabad, of Chachma, Bina, and Das. We're sort of in the middle, but I want to already start explaining what I'm saying here. The Rebbe now is going back to what we said in chapter 23, but from a different perspective, in a, if you will, more deep level of understanding it. In chapter 23, we discussed the Zohar. That was actually the almost initial thought of chapter 23. The Zohar saying that the commandments are like the limbs of God's body. Now that expression then in chapter 23 was only used vis-a-vis the commandments. At that point, we weren't talking about Torah study. Later in the chapter, however great is the fusion with God through commandments, it's even greater with Torah study because Torah study, God and you are one. Not two items serving each other, not two items fused, but literally one. But now we want to look at that phrase from the Zohar, from the Tikkunei Zohar, and we want to use it as a tool. Originally, we used it as a tool to say how precious the commandments are, but now we want to use it as a tool to actually understand how precious is Torah study. Now, why is that true from that phrase, which is really praising the commandments? The Rebbe says, think of what the Zohar is saying. The Zohar is saying that every command is like a limb, so to speak, of God's body. Now, obviously, God does not have a body. But as we understand the body, that dimension of God, a limb, that's very precious. That's very close. And we discussed in chapter 23 how powerful that is. That just as your body is naturally expressing your will, so too every commandment is like naturally an extension of the will of God. That's really amazing. And just as your will is expressed in your limbs, well, the commandments are expressing God's will. And therefore, when you do the commandment, you are drawing that highest, most inner will of God into not only this world, but all of creation. It's amazing. So this phrase was amazingly expressing how precious the commandments are. All that is true. We are not retracting anything we said. But the Rebbe said, think about this. If the commandments are compared to the limbs, there's Torah in there. Torah is not a limb of God. Torah, as we have learned since chapter 5 for sure, is God's thoughts, is the will and wisdom of God. So will and wisdom, that's not a limb, that's the brain. We have all these body parts, we have all these limbs of the body, and then we have the brain. Yes, being a limb of God is very special. We're not taking that away. And every limb is expressing the will of the possessor of that limb. And every commandment is flexing and expressing the inner will of God, and that's unbelievable. But can you compare the energy of someone in a limb compared to how they are invested in their mind? There's nothing that's us. That's the true us, like our mind. So all those body parts are wonderful, and all those body parts express us. But those body parts aren't our energy, like what's going on in our mind. So if all the commandments are limbs, and Torah is the mind, the thoughts of God, can't even envision how much more God is in Torah than in any other commandment at all. Just imagine, think of yourself, self in your hands, which definitely express self, self in your mind. That's you. That's the most intense self there is, right? And that's God in Torah. As the Rebbe goes on to explain, kacha mamish, so too literally, derech mashal, in following this parable, this metaphor, lahavdil, revavos havdalos le'en kates, tens of thousands of levels infinitely. The Rebbe is saying tens of thousands is already a finite number, so that's not true here. We're just saying like such an enormous, infinite degree of difference. The ha'aras or Ein Sof Baruch Hu, the shine of the infinite light of God, hamislapshos, the mitzvos maisios, that are engarbed, and they are engarbed every time you serve God and do that commandment. But you cannot compare the God investment in a commandment, l'gabe ha'aras or Ein Sof Baruch Hu, Ein Sof, in contrast to that shine from the infinity of the light of God, in the intellect of God, in the wisdom of Torah. Each one of us, how much are we getting this God in Torah? As much as we get the Torah. Each one, as much as we understand, as much as we comprehend. There's a very big advantage here to comprehending. Sometimes we can read a lot of deep stuff and it's really cool, but we don't really get it. For this, we have to really get it. So the Rebbe was saying, and again, this is an incredible thought the Rebbe is saying here. And like, it's so simple on one hand, but it's so incredible. God is invested in every commandment, like I am invested in every one of my limbs. And I am invested in every one of my limbs. And here I'm moving my hands all the time. And I'm moving my eyes in all directions. And I'm hearing all these sounds. All these things are me. Can't compare any of that to self-investment in my mind. Okay, that's the metaphor. God is expressed, is within every commandment. It's all him. It's all his will. It's all his limbs. But you can't compare that, the Rebbe says. You can't even give a finite, tremendous number like, and 1,000,000 steps more, 1,000,000,000 steps more, 1,000,000,000,000 steps more. No, the Rebbe said. It's infinite, the difference between God invested in the commandments and God in his thoughts, in Torah. That's not a limb, so to speak, of the body of God. That's the brain. You can't compare yourself in a limb or a brain. You can't compare God in a limb or brain. That God investment is unique and only in Torah. And you get that every time you study. I really get it. You get it as per how much you understand what you're studying. Because when your mind is grasping God's mind, that's what's right now in your mind. That's what's right now in your soul. That's what's right now gripping your animal. The investment of God himself in his very thoughts, that's what's taking you over. And that's why you process the world so differently. You process yourself so differently. That's why, as Rachel said before, the atmosphere gets a little junked up, a little polluted by the fears and concerns of the world. Study Torah. It all dissipates. Because look what you're bringing in. You're bringing in God direct. You're bringing in God who is found in Torah like in nothing else. Like not even in a commandment. That's the energy that's shining now in your home. People that are sensitive to energy, and even people that aren't so sensitive to energy, but when you walk in somewhere, you sort of pick up a feeling for the atmosphere. If you've ever walked into a place where there's a lot of Torah study there, the air feels a little different or a lot different. And conversely, if you walk into a place where there's a lot of spiritual pollutants, you feel it. The air just feels different and you're affected by it. Has anyone experienced that in either direction where they're walking into somewhere, just like if it's cold outside and you walk into your house and suddenly your house is so warm because it's so different than the outside. Once you're in your house for a while, it just feels regular. But when you first walk in, it's like so warm. So when you walk into a place where there's a lot of Torah study, you just feel it. Or you walk into a place where there's a lot of the opposite energy, you just feel it. Someone has experienced that? that sense of just the energy from all that Torah study, that the air is different? Well, I got 2 plus me, 3. I'm sure more people than that have seen it. Maybe some people just are raising their virtual hands. It's really powerful, and it's really powerful. And I believe that many of us, when we've walked into a place where there's a lot of Torah study, you feel it, because what you're feeling is God revealed, as the Rebbe said, in a way that's infinitely different than any other way of accessing him. A person could say, well, I'm really getting God. I'm really understanding God in his core and self. That's what's coming down to me through these words. Are these words really God? Now, this question is really something we actually discussed in chapter 4 of Tanya. Now, a person could say, if you're learning, let's say you're learning Jewish law, and this is kosher, this is not kosher. This is God's will and wisdom. This is God's will and wisdom dressed to be discussing the details of, the chicken soup and the milk, or the salting of the meat, or the washing of it. I mean, this is very physical realities. This is God. I understand deep within that is God's will and wisdom, but what's my mind is getting is it that depth of God's will and wisdom? I'm getting the milk and the meat and the chicken soup and the salt and the blood and all those very physical things. How could that be God? So even though you're only accessing the most peripheral layer, this emanation of God invested in that piece of Torah study, but Torah is compared to water. That just as water, if you have water on a very high mountain and the water descends, maybe it's snow and it melts and it goes all the way down to the valley, it's the same water. Same H2O. There it was so to speak, high. Now it's so low. Well, it's water. It's water. It's the same water. As we explained above in all the way back in chapter 4 of Tanya. Meaning the core thought, the thought of God within the law that in our world translates as how you precisely salt or wash that piece of meat, or what happens with a mixture, and what does it mean that the milk and the meat came together, and what does it mean that it's still okay, and what does it mean that it's not okay? Yes, we can't imagine any of that exists above by God where none of this physicality exists. But the core God thought that's an emanation of is still within the law that you are currently studying. And therefore, when you study it, that's what you get. It's almost like you can envision, this is not a metaphor I made up. I remember a student of mine many, many years ago made it up. She just said, oh, it's like, and it really struck me very deeply. She compared it to watching a movie. You can envision you're in a movie theater. I do believe movie theaters still exist somewhere in the world. You're in this movie theater, there's this huge screen and the sound and the everything, and now you pick up your phone and you watch the exact same movie on this very little screen. Very little screen. You must have lost some of the movie in the process. No, not at all. Every single thing that's projected on that massive screen is coming here. The same soundtrack, the same words, the same pictures. It's just in a very small fashion, but it's all exactly the same. God is shining through even this very small containment of physical reality and thoughts small enough that my human mind can grasp. Within that is shining that same God energy. If you can envision, for those people that know the fairy tale of the princess and the pea, where there's a princess. How do you know she's a princess? Because even though there's 30 mattresses between her and that pea, she still feels it. So that pea, that core, that God energy, that God will and wisdom, that infinite investment of God, even though there are all these layers between, penetrates right through. Like the Rebbe says, it's the same water. However high, however low, still the same H2O. That pea penetrates all those layers, and that's what your mind is grasping, which is incredible. And which then leads me to this dilemma, so to speak, of wow, I spent all this time discussing how charity, like nothing else, brings redemption. Now I'm saying how Torah is like nothing else. How do I reconcile this? How do I pull this all together? Well, for that, we're going to learn next week.